You may remember about a year ago, all of the flood waters, how big they were in KwaZulu-Natal. Incredible floods that took so many people from us, damaged so much property too. Incredible rain, even shipping containers, remember that, floating away at one point. Well, new research that suggests for various reasons these were the worst floods in recorded history in that province. Professor Stefan Grab is at the Wits School of Geography, Archaeology and Environmental Studies. He's the lead author on this. Professor, good afternoon to you. It's quite a big thing to say that these were the worst floods in this area in recorded history. What data did you look at to make that determination?
Good afternoon, Stephen and listeners. It's lovely to be on your program. We looked at predominantly 18th century and 19th century data based on documentary records, including some of the very earliest newspapers in the country. For example, the Natal Witness, as it was called in those days, was founded in 1846, and they very meticulously recorded floods during those times. And so based on these documentary records, including also old letters and missionary records, etc., we were able to reconstruct quite precisely a flood history for KwaZulu-Natal and more specifically for the Greater Durban region.
I work in television, Professor, and everyone likes a photograph. Were there photographs of the floods from that time?
Unfortunately not. I'm still looking for some of the earliest photographs, and we have indeed found some very early photographs, in fact, for Cape Town, going back to about the 1880s or 1890s.
It must still be quite hard to compare. Now, words can really help you. I mean, certain bridges in certain places, I imagine there's a record of where the bridge was. There might even be a record of what it was made out of. Was it out of iron and steel, or was it wood? How big was it? Was it big enough to take, say, an ox wagon? If it was big enough to take an ox wagon and then it was washed away, well, those were very heavy floods. So you're able to tell from the descriptions of what happened how bad the floods were then, and then obviously compare it with what we saw last year.
Yes. So they would often, in the newspapers and elsewhere, describe, for example, the width of particular rivers. So we know those same river systems today, and we know how wide they are. And so they would say that, for instance, a particular river, the Mzinduzi, would be almost half a kilometer in width across, when nowadays it's maybe 100 meters across. So based on these quite detailed descriptions, we can quite accurately reconstruct the extremity of the floods. Another example would be, for instance, the very big floods of 1856 were described as one of the most severe ever in Durban, and the entire town of Durban was flooded. Central Durban at the time, which is pretty much where central Durban is today, was completely flooded out. And so we have very accurate descriptions, quite often the depth of the water as well, how deep the waters were at the railway stations, etc.
So does this suggest then, from the evidence you have from that time, the evidence that we have now, that last year's floods were definitely worse than anything human beings had ever recorded in writing before?
So that always depends on one's perspective. From what perspective are we describing these as the worst? So we are saying that based on our historical analysis, the April 2022 floods were the worst in terms of lives lost. Okay, so we're looking at between probably 450 and 500 lives lost last year, which is far worse than we've ever had in a previous flood. In terms of economic losses, I mean, there's reports of figures going around $2 billion worth of economic loss. That is far greater than it, of course, ever has been previously. But as I say, one needs to put these things in perspective, because 150 years ago, you didn't have that type of economy, you didn't have that type of population. And so in terms of the percentage of the people impacted, adversely impacted, it may have been greater in the past, but of course fewer people affected. The second point to make is that the extent of the floods were not the most severe in 2022. We have had floods such as the September 1987 floods, which were far more extensive. They extended right across most of KwaZulu-Natal, especially the coastal regions, all the way up into Mozambique. And the number of homes lost and livelihoods affected was far greater back in 1987. So as I say, it depends on one's perspective of investigating these types of natural disasters.
From the information that you have and that you've looked at, does it suggest that this kind of flood is going to happen more often, or is happening more often, rather?
Yes, certainly. So based on the historical analysis, we counted the number of severe floods. These are floods that have severe consequences of one or more factors, including loss of lives, livestock, agriculture, infrastructure, etc. And on that basis, we can quite accurately say that there's been a doubling of the flood frequency over the last 100 or more years. So the frequency has doubled, and quite possibly the extremity or the severity of the floods has also increased over time. And that is a trend that has been, we can track that sort of trend over the last 100 or more years. And there's every indication that that trend will continue as the climate continues to warm. We would expect more severe rainstorms and hence more severe floods and an increased likelihood of floods going forward in time.
Professor Stefan Grab, thank you, at the Wits School of Geography, Archaeology and Environmental Studies.